I mean, it's actually been, in that sense, a really interesting semester, right? Because I've been able to teach the Mexico course, which has been a bit of a departure for me, in the sense that my focus in Latino studies has always been the border, and so I could talk to you about the issues in the last 30 years on either side of the U.S.-Mexico border, but I've never really been put in a position of having to talk about all of Mexico, right? Which is kind of a daunting task if you think about it in terms of covering 15 weeks, right? But it's been amazing. So I've been able to start to weave in the conquest narratives in terms of how they relate to the way we conceptualize Mexico now, and that has an impact on how we think about Mexican immigrants in the U.S., right? So it's actually a really fascinating course that that has worked out in some ways better than I had anticipated or could have hoped for. Let's put it that way. But then at the same time, teaching this course for the conference that we just put on was a really great opportunity. So I basically was able to take all of these scholars in minority studies from all over the country, ask them to send me their work either in progress or work that they had written previously or work that they were heavily influenced by, and then share that with a group of students that were just interested in the topic. There wasn't the burden necessarily of this fulfilling a requirement. It was just something that they were interested in, which meant that every week I got to come in and talk to 20 students who were deeply invested and already motivated and enthusiastic about the topic, and we just took it. So so it's been, in that sense, it's been great. I mean, it's been a really very an ambitious semester, right? Well, I think that Latino studies. I think you can't not be interested in Mexico if you want to talk about Latino studies, because the issue of immigration is such a central part to how we conceptualize Latinos in the U.S. And then Mexicans then comprise such a large portion of the population that I think understanding Mexico is really important in terms of understanding Latinos in the U.S. The problem is that we often sort of substitute knowledge of Mexico and Mexicans for Latino studies, right, in general. And so I think it becomes really important. And this is why I think in some ways I've been fortunate, because my focus in grad school and in my dissertation, my research has not been on Mexico, right? It's been on the other aspects of Latino studies. And so then getting the chance to teach these courses means that I'm sort of upping the ante of how I bring these two things together. Right? I think you could broaden the question to what do we need to know about Latinos, right? And I think that the answers the answer to that question holds true for the breadth of experience of Latinos in the U.S., right, and then throughout Latin America. And I think that is that the first thing is that our society, especially our media society, tends to sort of erase differences among Latino groups, and that's particularly unfortunate because they're coming from such disparate circumstances. And then the reception in this country often is heavily influenced by those originary circumstances, right? And so to talk about Mexican immigration is really radically different than talking about Puerto Rican immigration, which is radically different from talking about Cuban immigration. And so I think that what has tended to happen through programs like Latino in America, the CNN special, is that we tend to sort of erase these key differences and not talk about that particular country of origin and their particular relationship to the U.S. That makes a difference. And so I think that my classes ask students to consider those differences, to think carefully about what the label Latino even means, right? And to think about how the context influences the answer to that question. And then I think that's, that talking about immigration is a very cyclical event. It happens in this country every 15 or 20 years, right? Where it becomes very intense and polemical, and then recedes in the background and then comes back. And so I think that putting the current moment into a larger historical context helps. It helps in some ways reconceptualize it in ways that are more productive, right? As if it's not the end of the world, right? We've seen this before, right? And so I think that we can learn valuable lessons from how those conversations have taken place in the past. So my book manuscript that's in, it's in process, right? There's sort of been a reigning conceptualization in Latino studies that When you are south of the Rio Grande, you're talking about Latin Americans, right? And then as soon as you cross over, you're now talking about Latinos. And there's a way in which Latinos have been conceptualized as a people that are essentially produced by the political circumstances of the United States. That's what we mean when we talk about Latinos. So if you put that conversation to one side and then think about how we've been talking about in the last 2 or 3 decades about globalization, right? What does globalization mean? And some would argue that globalization is, has been taking place for centuries. Others would say that the kind of rapid, hyper-active globalization that we're seeing now is brand new, the last 30 years, right? But the point is that globalization is meant to sort of, we understand it as shrinking distances, right? It shrinks time, it shrinks space, it shrinks cultural differences. And so given that conversation, it always seemed to me sort of it always seemed sort of confusing to think about this notion that somehow Latinos would spring up out of U.S. soil as if disconnected in some ways from Latin Americans. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we, and I don't have a term for this yet, a really, cheeky academic term yet, but one of the basic things that motivates my book is the notion that Latinos are being produced outside of the U.S., right? Through political processes and through much more immediate contact with people that are already here, the people that are back home. And so what that has meant is that I've been trying to conceptualize what Latin American writers have to say about Latinos in the U.S. And can we start to think about Latino experiences that are much more hemispheric in scope, right? They don't sort of depend on us thinking solely about the U.S. as the context, right? It's much broader, it's much more throughout the Americas. That's the basic gist of what my research entails. And so what it's meant has been looking at writers who ordinarily wouldn't be considered Latino writers. They're Latin American writers. Like Alberto Fuguet, who's in Chile, Jorge Franco, who's Colombian. There's a writer in Ecuador, Gabriel Alemán, right? There's Luisa Valenzuela, who's a canonical Latin American writer, has written a lot of work about New York, right? And I think that her work forces us to think about these binaries as being really sort of not productive. So there's quite a few.
So if I were going to...
So Jorge Franco, for example, his novel it's called Paradise Travel. And I think that one of the things that I find that's really powerful about the novel is that it relates the experience of 2 undocumented migrants, right, illegal aliens. And I think that term has become so synonymous with Mexican immigration, right, in ways that's damaging both to how we conceptualize Latinos, but also Mexicans, right? I think that you can see this consistent pattern in the anti-immigrant rhetoric where the term Mexican has become derogatory, as if a nationality were derogatory, right? And so what this novel does is it gets us out of that construction, that construct of illegal aliens are Mexicans, Mexicans are illegal aliens. And he narrates the experience of 2 young Colombians who essentially have existed on the margins of Colombian society, but not in the way that we're typically taught to think about marginalization. These are 2 essentially young adults who just aren't going to make it either way. They're just stuck, right? So they're not dying of poverty, they're not dying of hunger, but they're also not, making it, whatever that would mean. And so this, I think, is a really accurate description of what motivates a lot of migration, right? This sense that somehow there's something better across the border, right? And there's a Harvard sociologist, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, who describes this as structures of desire. That essentially our U.S. globalization has been so economically and so hyper successful that we've essentially exported a lifestyle that's unsustainable, right? So that people move not because they need to, but because they know life could be better. In simple terms, like having a fridge, right? Or adding on a bedroom that separates the boys and the girls. So I think that, back to Franco's novel, I mean, I appreciate that it gives us a different perspective on illegal migration, and then also really emphasizes what it means to travel some of these huge distances that people travel to get to the U.S. Because, a a big portion of the migrants come from Central America, right, and are traveling already huge distances just to get to the border, right, with Mexico. So it's, yeah, I think it's a good start. It's a good place to start. Okay, so I've taught at 2 state institutions in the past, big state institutions, between grad school and then my first academic appointment for 10 months. And the thing that I noticed right off, I mean, most clearly, is that this is a place for people who take teaching very seriously. So, in other words, the expectation of research is it's heavy, it's rigorous, right? They want you to do good scholarly work, but not at the exclusion of your teaching. And so that what I think William & Mary has done is to put to be very strategic about how that balance looks, which has meant, in my opinion, that the students here get an outstanding education. I think that if I were to choose a place for my kids to go to college, I would want them in an environment where their professors care about them, know who they are, right? And not care about them in sort of an abstract, I care about my students way, but legitimately, I haven't seen you, what do you need, what's going on, right? Or I've seen your work and I actually think you're capable of much better than this, so let's talk about it, right? That doesn't happen at larger institutions. And the second thing that I've noticed is that the kinds of students that William & Mary attracts are bright, motivated, ambitious, and not necessarily ambitious in a kind of obsessive way, right? So not, some of them know exactly what they're going to do and have known since they were 8 years old, right? But a lot of them don't. A lot of them simply know that if they dedicate themselves to their work in a certain way, it'll work out. Good things will happen, right? And so I think that there's a real palpable sense of just ambition as sort of just as a general quality of students. And then also I think that I actually feel like students that come to William & Mary, it's almost liberating because they're good students, right? They're high achievers, and I think that they weren't always in a context that valued that socially, right? So their teachers in high school might have appreciated that, but their peers might not have. And so I think that what that's meant is that they can come here and feel like, it's actually okay for me to really care about what I'm doing, right? And to be, visibly enthusiastic about the subjects. I think teaching in Hispanic Studies and teaching in Spanish, I get the students who were just eager to speak in Spanish, right? Who are willing to throw themselves into it, knowing that their accent's going to be wrong, that they're going to get the wrong pronouns, but they're excited to do it, which actually makes my job really a pleasure. I mean, I walk in and I feel like half the work is done because they're ready to go. They want to do this. It's hard to complain about that.